Hey everyone, welcome to the second episode of our podcast. As always, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Faith.
And this history podcast is going to be full of quick-fire information while still entertaining.
Today's episode is about Egypt from 1650 to the start of the French invasion. We will give you all a timeline and an outline of our favorite acronym, SPRITE, which, as you all know, stands for social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, and economic.
Overall, you'll get a quick, summed-up version of Egypt with the two best podcast hosts, us. And we are so excited to share this with you.
Similar to last time, we will look at the SPRITE acronym and how it relates to Egypt at this time.
The important social event that was going on during this time was the multiple famines people experienced. In just 45 years, Egypt went through 6 famines. Maybe they should get some food from our school's farmers. The last and final famine during this time was 1784, and this was the big one. It killed nearly a sixth of Egypt's population. Because food was so scarce, people were forced to keep from starving by eating dogs, cats, rats, and dead animals. Apparently, some even went as far to eat their own children. I've been super hungry, but never enough to eat another person. Cannibalism would be a new low for me. I guess if we're going to talk about the famines, I should probably explain why these were happening. Because the government was unable to pay loads of the taxes the farmers were demanding, the peasants left their village, stopped growing crops, and turned to more nomadic lifestyles. So the population of Egypt went from about 7 million people to 3.8 million in 1798.
Like in our world today, the politics in Egypt were seriously messed up. The Ottomans continued to rule the land until the French invasion of May 1798. But we are going to talk more about that later. Egypt went through 6 leaders during this time, each one reigning for an average of 35 years, which, compared to Queen Elizabeth, is kind of pitiful. In 1786, Egypt defaulted on its payment to Istanbul, and the Ottoman Sultan was forced to dispatch troops to regain control of the province.
Not much changed religiously for the Egyptians during this time. They remained Muslim the entire time they were occupied by the Ottomans.
In 1744, the Egyptians built a really fancy building called the Fountain of Abdullah Rahman Katkuda, which is impossible to pronounce. This included a well, an elementary Quran school, a residential wing. Its exterior featured floral designs and the interior featured tiled work, which showed influences from all over Turkey. Over 100 of these buildings were built during the Ottoman period.
The economy in Egypt took a dip when their trade routes were taken over by the Portuguese and when the Europeans took control of the seaborne trade. Egypt, however, was a leading seller of coffee, sugar, and rice to the rest of the Ottoman Empire. When tobacco was introduced to the area, it was another major area of profit for them. Unfortunately, going back to the famines, high agriculture was occasionally stalled because of the low Nile floods or outbreaks of the plague. I can imagine it would be difficult to farm if you were always sick or there was no water.
The French invasion was led by Napoleon I. Egypt was super important because it provided the shortest route to the riches of the East. They even described it as the master key to all the trading nations of the earth. In May 1798, the French dispatched a group to secure Egypt, strengthen the French trade routes, and open a possible route of attack towards British India. On July 21st, a large Mamluk army went to attack Napoleon's troops at the Battle of the Pyramids. Unfortunately for them, the French won the battle and occupied Cairo within the next 24 hours. Eventually, the French got bored and left to continue to fight the British over India. After they left, the Mamluks and the Ottomans continued to fight for the land.
Now we're going to focus in on the political aspects with the timeline.
In 1605, the Ottoman governor of Egypt was killed during the first series of revolts by rebels. I guess he didn't last very long. This branched from the growing tensions between the foreign governors and the local revenue farmers. The farmers were under significant pressure to provide tribute to Istanbul. After this, powers lie with the Janissary military corps, which is an infantry unit and a standard army. The men in this army were not free, as they were slaves of the Sultan. Power being in the hands of the Janissary caused it to be gradually integrated into local society and have a weaker sense of allegiance to Istanbul.
A large focus in this timeline is the capital of Egypt, Cairo. The city is known for its famous Giza Pyramid complex, which holds one of the world's 7 wonders. A few crucial things happen here in the timeline that we are covering.
In 1774, the Mosque of Abu al-Dahab was built in the capital. Between 1779 and 1788, the Muzaffar Khan Palace was built by a wealthy merchant by the name of Muhammad Muharrem. On June 1st, 1779, Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Cairo to conquer the whole of Upper Egypt. He was doing this to a lot of different places during this time. We will dive further into this due to its significance, but these are just a few other main events that take place in Cairo.
In 1700, the neighborhood around Cairo's port of Bulaq developed with a patronage of the Ottoman officials since it was one of the few places in the city that was not highly populated. On the Nile River, Port Bulaq was a major suburb before the city of Cairo grew around it. Eventually, it became the main port and industrial district. Due to the falling revenues, their patronage was on the smaller side than the previous century.
In 1744, the fountain of Abdul Rahman Calcutta was built, which we mentioned earlier in the episode.
1786 began the time when Egypt defaulted on their payments to Istanbul, which forced the Ottoman Sultan to dispatch troops to regain control of the province. A French expeditionary force commanded by Napoleon occupies Egypt. This will be later known as the Battle of the Pyramids. The French ruled Egypt for 3 years and tried to expand into Syria, but they were repulsed by allied Ottoman and British troops. Bonaparte's famous quote when they arrived in Egypt reads, "From the heights of the pyramids, 40 centuries look down on us." This is because he chose to trek his 37,000 troops through the desert as opposed to following the Nile River from Alexandria. Troops told of thirst, discomfort, disease, and death that were experienced during their travels. However, he famously routed the Mamluk cavalry by using his division square tactic. Defeating the great rule of the Mamluks enhanced Bonaparte's reputation.
He then made himself the master of Egypt by force and began instilling elements that he thought were crucial. This would include the Institut d'Egypte for French scholars, a library, a chemistry laboratory, a health service, a botanical garden, an observatory, an antiquities museum, and a zoo.
In this episode, we have a super exciting source to share with you. We have access to a letter from Napoleon I to his soldiers during one of their expeditions. In this letter, he praises the soldiers in his army for doing an amazing job. He next adds a section about how they can improve. The letter was written around the same time as the Battle of the Pyramids, which we talked about earlier.
The letter is fairly short, so I'm going to read an excerpt from it. To you, soldiers, will belong the immortal honor of redeeming the fairest portion of Europe. The French people, free and respected by the whole world, shall give Europe a glorious peace, which shall indemnify it for all the sacrifices which it has borne the last 6 years. Then, by your firesides you shall repose, and your fellow citizens, when they point out any one of you, shall say, he belonged to the army of Italy.
We talked about it a bit in the timeline, but for us it was cool to see a first-hand source, which actually explained Napoleon's thinking.
Well, that concludes our second episode. We are so glad you all came back to listen to us yap. We cannot wait to dive back in during the next unit. Stay tuned.
Bye! Oh, bye!